Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Jutta Paulus.
Good morning. Good to see so many people here who are interested in the new sin list and also in getting forward on a clean circular economy. And thank you very much for having me here. And thank you all for your interest. And thank you, Anne-Sophie, for the examples which you just gave us, like PFAS, which is a very big issue in my home constituency, actually, because we have groundwater being very much polluted with PFAS due to the neighborhood to a military airport, where there have been fire extinguishing trainings going on for many, many years, and now the PFAS is in the groundwater, also in the surface water. No one knows how to get it out. No one knows who is going to pay for it, because the US Army obviously won't do it. And this is a very serious issue, and I'm very glad that finally it starts to sink in that these sort of substances presents a risk not only to health, not only to environment, but in the end also to public purses. Because at the end of the day, probably public money will be used to clean up this mess. Also, I want to thank ChemSec for their important work, because if it weren't for organizations like ChemSec, we would have to rely on regulatory processes which are, due to their nature, much slower than the work you are doing. And I think it's an inspiration for us as policymakers, and should also be an inspiration for organizations like ECA, who of course rely on the regulatory measures, but who could find some inspiration in the approaches. Also, I want to thank Anne-Sophie for mentioning positive lists. I'm a very big fan of positive lists, actually. Always have been in my original profession as a pharmacist, where we, or the organization I was part of, were always pushing for positive lists in medicine, in pharmacological substances, but this has always been opposed very much by the pharmaceutical industry, obviously, because if your substance or your active substance is not on the positive list, there is no real market. So they always wanted to have everything in order to be able to sell everything. And I think it's pretty similar if you look at the chemical industry. They will not be glad about a positive list for any additive or any use, because obviously they would have to fulfill very high criteria in order to get their substances on there. The problem of toxic substances, we focus a lot, at least in the NV we focus a lot on the risks to human health. But in my opinion, we should focus more on the risk to the environment, to biodiversity, to ecosystem functionality. For example, we have this discussion about glyphosate. Glyphosate is discussed as possible cancerogenic, but having read a bit about it and having spoken to a few people about it, they said, well, look at what glyphosate was originally made for. Originally, it was made as antimicrobial substance. And later on, one discovered, oh, great, this is a herbicide too. But by applying glyphosate in big quantities to very large areas of our arable land, we disturb the microbiome which is in our soils. Obviously, it's a antimicrobial substance. And we are not able to have an overview of how soil life is actually hampered by applying the substance. But we only look at the health risks for humans. And I think that's just looking too short, because in the long run, we are all dependent on having fertile soils. So in my opinion, this should be a much larger proportion of the assessment of a chemical substance. Well, we have these toxic substances directly killing organisms, but we also have harmful effects which lead to lower resistance towards other stressors, such as viruses, such as even heat. It has been found out that plants which are affected by certain chemicals are less resistant to heat, are less resistant to other weather conditions. And so I think we should also have a look at that. And of course, endocrine disruptors are a big topic now, and it's not only that they are disturbing reproduction, they have other effects on the body. Probably all of you have heard about the discussion on the chalk teeth, which are a growing problem, and one estimates that 1/3 of the children which are younger than 12 years old are affected by this effect. The effect is that the second teeth break through, being porous and being very, very sensitive to touch, and also very, very easily affected by caries. Is it caries in English too? And there are certain studies pointing towards endocrine disruptors playing a role here. It's nothing certain yet. It's not really proven yet, but in my opinion, the precautionary principle should apply here. So if there is this suspicion that chalk teeth may be linked to endocrine disruptors being present in the mother's blood during pregnancy, then we should go on and find a strategy for endocrine disrupting chemicals, which we don't have now. I mean, France has one, but the European Union doesn't have one. Parliament has been pressing for it for quite a while now, and I have good hope that Mrs. Sinkevičius, our new commissioner for the environment, is going forward with it. At least at the hearing, he was very ambitious on everything that's got to do with zero pollution, non-toxic environment. I mean, non-toxic environment has been promised to us in the 7th Environmental Action Plan and should have been delivered 1 year ago. And even EU Council was not happy about Commission not doing their work, and I really hope that we will see a first draft in the next year. So what action do we need to take? As I said, we need a more holistic approach to substances which can harm not only health but also environment and environmental functions. We need a phasing out of these substances, and we need a fast phasing out. I learned that even though there might be a REACH dossier which says, okay, this substance has this and that properties, this would not lead to immediate action, because the member states have their own interest in what they would like to see on the candidate list and what they wouldn't like to see on the candidate list. And sometimes these interests are linked to industry's interests. And I think we have to get over the approach, everything that's good for the economy is good for the people and the consumers, but we should say everything that's good for a clean economy is good for the consumers. As I said, we've been waiting very long for the Environmental Action Plan, and the good thing is that not only Sinkevičius promised to deliver on zero pollution, but also that Ms. von der Leyen has announced it, so there's a certain pressure behind it to the respective DG to do their work. I don't have to explain anyone about REACH, I guess, as you're all experts in the field. I think the biggest loophole is the relatively easy authorization of substances which have hazardous properties. And also, I'm very much looking forward to the database which ECHA will provide in 2020, because it's not only the waste treatment operators who can have access to the database, but it's also consumers. And so toxic substances which are still around, which should have been banned long before, this is a very important information for the waste treatment operators, because they have to deliver on the high recycling quotas which EU has given in regulation. But this is the danger, that through these high recycling quotas, we keep substances in the loop which should have been phased out long ago. One very prominent example, of course, is bromine flame retardants, which are still in because of recycling processes. And what we would also need is a standard for secondary raw materials, because I've spoken to quite some waste treatment operators and also recyclers, and they said, we've got a problem, we don't know what's in these materials. And our customers say, oh, if you don't know, I won't buy your material, I'll go for example, virgin plastics in order to pack my food, because I can't risk any carcinogenic material being present in my food packaging, because I'll be liable for it, you won't, so I won't buy from you. And I think the only way to tackle this is have a standard for secondary raw materials and also have strong enforcement of the standard, obviously, because the producer of the secondary raw material can only be true to his word if he has a certain if you can rely on waste being enforced. So, for example, a lot of people just throw their electronic devices into the plastic bag. And then you get in all sorts of metals in that. And so the waste treatment has to make sure that these products don't enter the chain, which is very ambitious, which will cost money, of course, but the easiest way to do it is have an eco-design in the first place that doesn't permit the producers to put in these substances in the first place. So we need the transparency, we need the good supply chains, and the companies must be pushed not to use toxic substances in the first place. We have the eco-label, which covers energy efficiency, which covers repairability, but which doesn't look at chemical risk. And I think that would be something that we as policymakers would have to push for in order to make sure that consumers are protected from chemical risk and environment is protected from chemical risk. Right now, we have quite a few labels which are not very well controlled. There's really the danger of greenwashing, because companies can just invent a label and no one really knows what's behind the label. So I think we should have a common approach to labeling too, so that no one can just say, well, I've got a label and there's a beautiful pigeon on there and so it's good for the environment. Wait, I just got a problem with my notes. Yes, the toxic ingredients which are present in older products before REACH still end up in recycling streams, and we don't have any traceability. But at the base of this problem is that substances are banned so late. For example, when I was a young girl, suddenly people started talking about formaldehyde, because formaldehyde was present in all sorts of cosmetic products, unthinkable today. But back then, we had shampoos, we had all sorts of products with formaldehyde. And then the switch was made to parabens. Today, we're talking about parabens maybe causing breast cancer. So we are always lagging behind because scientific knowledge advances, and it takes very long until scientific knowledge really sinks into regulation. And this is, again, so important that there are actors out there who can be faster than regulation can be. For example, last night until very, very late, I was in a trilogue concerning tire labeling. And we had a big discussion on when will this legislation be reviewed, when will classes be rescaled, energy efficiency classes, obviously. And as I'm a newly elected member, I was very surprised to learn that from the first inkling, we have to rescale the classes until this rescaling being implemented after the whole legislative frame. We have 3 or 4 years. And I think that's very, very long for a customer, from the customer's view. And, but I do understand that this complicated process on the EU level, involving Commission, involving Parliament, involving the Member States, finding compromises, having stakeholders hearings and all that takes very long. And so your role as ChemSec and the SIN list is, it can't be replaced by regulation because you give the information to the first movers, to those companies who say, well, it's fine if this is regulated, but we will look at things which are not regulated yet. And we want to go further than just waiting for regulation forcing us to do something. And I think these companies are also have a better place on the market because consumers become more and more aware of those issues, and consumers want to choose more environmentally friendly issues. Consumers are very aware about health risks which are present in products, in their food, in everyday products they use. I think what's really a good thing is that the ECHA has now announced they will use a group approach, finally. We've been waiting very long for that. So, for example, industry said, well, you don't want bisphenol A? Great, we'll just replace it with bisphenol S, which is not what we were looking for and which won't be a solution in the end, because even if bisphenol S has some slightly different properties from bisphenol A, it won't be a solution, obviously. And so I'm very glad that Bjorn Hansen told us when he was present in the ENVI committee last week that they will go forward with a group approach, ranking all bisphenol, or classifying all bisphenols as one. And I'd even go further, saying we need not only a group approach, but a properties approach. So we have to treat all substances equally that have certain properties, such as endocrine disrupting possibilities. I should stop now. Okay. I do want to share one last thing from my previous work in the laboratory, because we were doing all those studies which we needed for each registration. And every now and then, most of the time, relatively shortly before the respective deadline, companies came up to us and said, well, we still need this and that study because we have to adhere to the deadline, which is going to be due in 8 weeks, and how fast can you do it? And we were like, you should have come maybe 1 year earlier, because now we are fully booked, and we can't do any magic, so we are very sorry. We can't serve you. And what are you going to do now? We'll just put in some value, maybe will not be scrutinized. And the German Environmental Agency made an assessment and finding that a huge number of dossiers is incomplete, is flawed, contains data which is not very, which can't really be. And I think this could have been prevented if there had been serious fines on incomplete dossiers, which we didn't have. Now ECHA is stocking up their personnel to do more checks on the dossiers, but we should have done in legislation the provision that if the dossier is incomplete, no market access is granted. So it would have been a much higher risk to present the agencies with an incomplete dossiers, because as it is, there's no real risk, because ECHA will ask nicely to fill in the gaps, and if you're not doing it, they'll ask nicely again. And the real risk to be thrown out of the market comes much too late. And to fill up with what you said in the beginning, I would be very grateful if everyone in this room and possibly all your colleagues and friends would think about the possibility to tackle those imports which you have mentioned, because if people order products at, for example, Alibaba, and these are delivered by mail or a little package by DHL or whomever, we have no possibility of regulating anything. And things will be entering our waste chain.
Okay,
Sorry for taking so long.